I work in food service, front of house, so in the early days of the pandemic with restaurants closed, I was taking work wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people, so I jumped at the opportunity right away. Ironically, the medical office job had been the safest gig I'd been offered thus far, COVID-wise. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could, due to crowds, so I decided to swing for a rideshare app. It's not all that expensive in my area, and I really didn't want a virus. I headed in at almost 3 a.m. because it was after the cleaning crew had left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious though, because I was exhausted. I stumbled onto the block looking for my ride, and to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up asking, "Uber?" while I cluelessly wandered up and down the street searching. The ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I'm not familiar with all of the surrounding areas and thought nothing of it. I was trying to pass the time playing games on my phone and stuff. The car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one, so I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. I shut my phone down to airplane mode and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. I don't often take rideshare, so being alone with a strange driver often put me a bit on edge, but this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about him. He looked a little like my brother even. Young, clean kept, listening to jazz, nothing that screamed you need to micromanage this trip. When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I was in too deep of a sleep and couldn't fully distinguish it from my dream. Finally, he awkwardly jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, Mayam, we're here now." I was embarrassed that I'd been that out of it, so I just gave a hurried thanks and booked it out of the car and into the building. As I looked around, I began to realize nothing was what I had expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked up the business, and it had appeared to be a strip mall plaza. The further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The structure was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black dark past the entryway. I expected some lights to be off in the nighttime, but not to the whole building. I skittered across the concrete foundation comprising what was left of the lobby area, told myself they must just be renovating, and followed signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages, but was likely just a few minutes, all I had passed was construction equipment, a couple locked doors, and some smashed windows. I was certain I was not going to find a medical office and figured maybe I had mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my texts that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try and get in touch with the driver, because if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling a second trip, considering this was all his mix-up. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one I had taken up, so would force me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker. Especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something, so jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and a request to call 911 to help get me from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night and didn't have enough reception to call a new ride, but the message wasn't sending. Reception was too weak. I gave up on getting my phone going and started checking for another stairwell or even window with balconies or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort. I scrambled over to a door with a stairs sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured, based on my walkabout, the floor was basically a giant loop, so I would have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint the opposite direction of wherever they were going and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there feel as though I trespassed and become hostile towards me, or have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to just 30 seconds, and the person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, it was just the Uber driver. I figured he had come back for me, realizing he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. I came out from the beam I was hidden behind and started to wave him down. But then I processed, there was no way for him to realize this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly, and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he might have returned. But in the moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes. Operating solely on muscle memory and instinct, I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think he'd seen where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised, but nothing was completely broken. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door. It was too dark to tell, I was disoriented from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, there's another one of these guys. And I stumbled backwards, trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could, a voice called out, "All right, this is the police department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such a fight or flight mode and had already committed to flight that I continued looking for ways to get out. He kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, "Hey," I said on the ground, "right now. Hands out where I can see them." He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did exactly as he asked. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see he was really a police officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions, and that, combined with what had just happened, and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into my being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He was even asking easy questions too, like, "Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke or cut me? Would you rather talk in here or outside?" My total stunned babbling in response at first led him to believe I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car, with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked the same questions again. The first thing I could think to ask was, "Did my friends call you? What did they tell you?" And he explained, "No, nobody called him. He was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of this building that's known to be condemned, and nobody's supposed to be inside, and when they are, they're not up to no good. He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up or meet a John, he had resources he could direct me to, and that this was not an ideal place to do either of those things, and asking if I had somewhere safe to stay that night. But I was stuck on something else he'd said. Finally, it all clicked. The car. I spilled my whole rideshare story in a frantic word vomit. He looked around and the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me all the details I remembered and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much. But the officer realized I could pull up my Uber app and get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception there, even outdoors, so we sped down the road, and once I had enough bars, the app roared to life, and I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. They said, "Hello, I've arrived. And I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct? And I am flashing my hazards. And finally, unfortunately, your driver had to cancel." At first, I thought the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and canceling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off, and exonerating himself. But instead, I checked the car details, checked again, and it was definitely not the same driver. The person who'd driven me there had not been my Uber. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this guy pulled up to me. The policeman took my statement and said they would keep an eye out for the guy, but the best I could give them to go off of was basically a young-looking Caucasian man with brown hair, sideburns, goatee, and 4-door sedan. Wearing a zip-up sweatshirt. Maybe had a hood. Which is, like, 1 out of every 4 guys in this city. I feel so blessed to have survived this near miss. Suffice it to say, I do not take rideshare services anymore. Quadruple check your license plate and driver name. You just never know. This happened a few years ago, so excuse me if the details are a little blurry. I was close friends with this one girl. I'm going to call her A. It was July, and we were hanging out. A told me about this really creepy house down the road from her place. At this point, we had been exploring abandoned houses most of the summer, and she had never told me about this one before. I asked A about the house, and she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She told me how a few months ago her and her other friend went into the house. Nothing seemed weird or out of place, but as they stood of what was left of the living room, they heard a deep growl come from all around them. Not just behind them or above them, but the sound surrounded them. They sprinted out and went home, not really ever talking about it. Me being dumb, it piqued my interest. We had been to a handful of houses before and nothing really ever happened. I convinced A to take me to this house. She kinda laughed a little. She agreed to take me, as long as we get baked beforehand. Sure, okay, I'm not 100% sure that's going to help, but okay. So she packed a bowl, did her thing, and we were off. It was a 15-minute walk from her place, and you couldn't really see the house from the street. It was surrounded by trees and high grass. We found a little path into the house. It was only maybe 20 feet from the street. We walked around the property. There wasn't a bird to be seen or heard. There was just absolutely no wildlife around this house. We walked around and found a jar of nails, a jar of pee and rusty nails, an altar of some sort with 2 chairs in front of it. There was a little shed-like thing 10 feet from the house with a copper wire leading to the attic of the house. We found 2 mounds of dirt that had grass growing on top of it, kinda looked like graves. Altogether, it's pretty weird, and I'm uncomfortable. This place feels weird, and we haven't even gone inside this little cottage yet. Around the side of the house laid a homemade ladder on the ground, and it had been there a while. We finally made our way to the front door and made our way in. The place was half burnt up, huge holes in the ceiling. To your left was shelving, and to your right was the living room. It had 2 couches, burnt up and little, a TV, a table, and through the living room was the kitchen. The kitchen was burnt to a crisp, no way to get into the kitchen to look around, same with the back hallway leading to the bedrooms. A walked through the living room, I sort of followed her, not really entering. This place was giving me the creeps. There was gas jugs littered all over the place, and the place just felt heavy and unwelcoming. As I was looking around, A was leaning on the couch looking at a wallet. Suddenly I heard footsteps above us. Like I said before, there were holes in the ceiling that lead to the attic. There's also no possible way to get to the attic from inside the house. Freaked out, I looked at A to see if she heard it too. She looked at me, and suddenly the footsteps were coming from all around us, above us, beside us, in front of us. We freaked and ran through the front door and ran back home. After we calmed down, we asked each other if we heard the footsteps. We were 100% positive we were alone in that house. For weeks after, I would see a dark mass in my room and out of the corner of my eye. I was having a string of bad luck. The last time I've seen the mass-like being, I got into a car accident, and when I looked in my rear-view mirror, I saw this black mass in my back seat. I have no idea if it was connected to the house we went into, but I am never going back in that house again. I live in a rural area in the north of the UK. About 20 minutes outside of the village I live in is a large complex of abandoned buildings. I haven't ever been able to get a straight answer on what these used to be. Some say an old farm, others say it was an RAF, UK Air Force, base. Either way, it is a cool place to explore and any kid's dream. I'm older now, but I practically grew up here, spending many summers at this place with my group of mates. We're all older now, so we don't go anymore. I mention how many times I have been to demonstrate how comfortable I am with this place. Any creepy feelings usually associated with abandoned buildings have worn off because of how many times I have been here. I should also mention that in all my time visiting this place with my friends, we have never seen anyone else there. It was kind of like our place. Tonight I was chilling with a mate at my house. We are both going to separate universities in a few weeks, so we were feeling quite reflective and started talking about our childhoods, and in particular our many trips to these abandoned buildings. Eventually, although it was late, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to hop in his car and drive the short journey to this place. When we got there, it was pitch black and we had absolutely no gear except the torches on our phones. He had even come straight from work, so was in his formal suit. We arrived at the place and began walking around, looking in all the buildings and recounting stories of all the summers we had spent here. We were talking carelessly and loudly. In hindsight, this was probably a mistake. We were quite deep in the complex when it started, a loud tapping, the sound of metal on metal. It startled us and we both jumped. In an effort to calm ourselves down, we told each other it was probably the wind. It didn't take us long to work out that this couldn't be the case. The tapping has a rhythm to it, but it was one that would keep on changing. A few times it would even have a recognizable tune such as Queen, "We Will Rock You." At this point, me and my mate were terrified. We started to slowly, as quietly as possible, go back the way we had come and towards where his car was parked. We had only made it a few meters when I accidentally stepped on a bit of MDF board lying on the floor. It snapped with what felt like the loudest sound in the world. At that point, the tapping abruptly stopped and everything went silent. We started to creep away again. We had only made it a bit further when something I will never forget, but wish I could, happened. We heard a voice. It sounded mad. It was loud and clear enough to hear, a man's voice, and it was speaking English, but what it was saying didn't make sense, just a random jumble of words and phrases blurted out without any pause. At this point, we both broke. We sprinted towards the way out, suppressing the urge to scream like kids. As we were running to the entrance, we ran past another building. As we ran past, quite loudly this time, we heard another voice. It was a man's voice again, but definitely different from the first one. This was saying a similar assortment of nothing, but we didn't stop to listen. We sprinted full tilt till we got to his car, hurled ourselves in, and screeched off. We got back to my place and practically hugged each other for the rest of the night. It might not sound that creepy now, but something about those voices coming from the abandoned buildings put fear in the animal part of my brain.